Good evening. Thank you for joining me. I'm Jared Morris, and this is Settled Christianity, the ministry for counseling, for teaching, for apologetics coming out of West Virginia. And I'm excited today for the very last video of this year. I'm going to go back and look a little bit more on the Christmas season, since I did one video, but I think that I should take a more doctrinal look on one aspect of it, specifically the prophecies. And around this time, around Christmas time, there's always this debate that comes up online regarding Isaiah 7, chapter 7, verse 14. And it says, let's see here, therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. And this verse is referenced in the New Testament in Matthew when the angel tells Mary and Joseph that, her being a virgin is going to conceive a child, and you're going to name him, Jesus. You're going to name him Emmanuel, meaning God with us. And it's always around this time that we deal with both Jewish adherents and people who hold to a more liberal Christianity, people who don't really take the Bible very seriously. And they argue that this verse is not talking about Jesus, that this verse just has nothing to do with the Messiah, and that Matthew misunderstood it, or that Matthew mistranslated it. And so today I'm just going to lay out the Jewish/liberal Christian argument for why we should not take this verse to be talking about the Messiah, even though Matthew directly relates to it. So pretty much the Jewish argument here is that Isaiah is talking to King Ahaz about enemies of Israel at that time, enemies of Jerusalem who wants to destroy them. And he tells him, and I'm not going to go into the whole history, but he tells him basically there's going to be a child born, and you're going to have this sign, and it's going to be this child being born of a virgin, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. And it says, goes down, for before the child shall know to refuse evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. And he says, hey, this is when this child is born, before it reaches really the age of accountability, before it can really understand good and evil, these two kings are going to fail. And so Jews come along and they say, well, look, this isn't talking about Jesus. This isn't talking about a Messiah some hundreds of years later. This has to be talking about a kid being born in that day, because that's really the only thing that makes sense in this case, if it's going to be a sign for Ahaz. And they go on and they argue. In chapter 8, we see that Isaiah and his wife has a son, which they call Maher-shalal-hash-baz, longest name in the Bible. And most Jewish people say, oh, there it is. That's the sign. And to the Jews and many liberal Christians, there's a pretty clear-cut argument that, oh, Emmanuel is just talking about Isaiah's son, and he's going to say, oh, look, my son's going to be born, and before he even knows right and wrong, those two kings are going to fail. It's going to be fine. This is a sign to you, King Ahaz. And therefore they usually argue that Matthew is taking from a bad translation, and that the word virgin here really should mean young woman. It could be a young married woman. It doesn't have to be a virgin. They usually argue that it would be pointless if the sign came hundreds of years later. And this is, they usually argue that Matthew, desperate to have validation for Jesus, ended up looking in the Old Testament and just applying random texts to him to try to prove, like, oh, wow, he really is the Messiah. But I'm going to argue that that's not the case, and that this passage is, in one way or another, talking about Jesus. And there's several different interpretations that even Christians hold to. There's many that say that this is a dual prophecy, which we might talk about in more length in a future video. But those people say that Maher-shalal-hash-baz was like the first more temporal fulfillment of this prophecy, that Jesus was like the true fulfillment down the line. And I believe that there's some argument that can be had there. There's several others argue that, that this isn't talking about Maher Shalal at all. It's just talking about Jesus. That Jesus is the one and only fulfillment of this prophecy. So, without further ado, what makes me think and what makes many Christian scholars believe that this passage is talking about the Messiah? Well, two things really stick out, and there's quite a few things. I'll go ahead and answer the argument that the word here that we translate as virgin should be young woman. I'd argue that looking in the passages that this word in Hebrew is used as well, it usually is talking about a young woman who seems to be unmarried. In many verses, it doesn't lean one way or another, and so I believe that this verse could be interpreted both as virgin or as young unmarried woman, which is basically virgin in those days. A young unmarried woman who is righteous would be a virgin until her marriage. So that's just an answering of one Jewish critique of this view. But I believe the two biggest things for me is one, that this passage is very, very shallow if it's just talking about Mahal Shalal Hasbaz. The very fact that in this conversation, Isaiah says, oh, hey, I'm going to give you a sign. Ahaz says, nope, I don't want a sign. And he says, okay, well, here you go. A child's going to be born named Emmanuel, and he's going to be assigned to you. And the problem is that in this case, if Isaiah is talking about a natural born child of his own wife, this doesn't seem to be, well, actually, it's not miraculous pretty much at all. Obviously, all childbirth is a miracle, but in the case of a sign from God, it's not really an argument to say, oh, look, my wife naturally had a child, and I also named him this special name. That's a sign from God. No one really buy that. And so in that case, I'd feel that it's reason to believe that there's a deeper meaning to this, that Isaiah isn't just talking about the natural birth of a child who is his own, who has a special name because he gave it to him, but I believe that it's evidence that this passage is talking about something far deeper than just a natural born child. And finally, the second big thing in my mind, and this is so important, and it's usually not really talked about by Jewish commentators of this passage, where this is one of two uses of the word Emmanuel in Isaiah. And the thing is when we go through chapter 7 through about chapter 11, we find quite a few references, maybe directly or indirectly, to Emmanuel, and it seems to paint a much, much bigger picture, that if the Jews are willing to argue that this is talking about the natural child of Isaiah, that they would have to argue that he accomplished or was much, much more grand than the Bible paints him to be. We're going to look at some of those passages. We see in chapter 8, you go down, and it talks about in 8, and he shall pass through Judah. Actually, we'll just go up to 7. It says, now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria in all his glory, and he shall come up over all his channels, and go over all his banks. And he shall pass through Judah, and he shall overflow and go over. He shall reach even to the neck and to the stretching of his wings, and feel the breath of thy land, O Emmanuel. And now, obviously, Jews could say that, saying that it's his land, that it's Emmanuel's land, would just mean that Emmanuel lives there. And maybe that's a possible interpretation, but I believe with the future passages that we have coming up, that it's very, very hard to say that, it just happens to be the place he lives. I believe this connotes some type of ownership of the land to Emmanuel, that Jerusalem and Israel and Judah, that this is the Emmanuel's land, that he owns this, that the Emmanuel, this is his property, is where they're living. And we go in chapter 9 in a much more, it doesn't use the word, but it talks about, connects once again into the idea of a child being born. In chapter 9 and verse 6, it says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this." And this is a big deal. Obviously, Isaiah did not think his son had a right to the throne of David. In fact, he knew he didn't. And so the thing is that whoever this child is, I believe, connecting back to the child to be born named Emmanuel, he has some big shoes to fill. Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And we turn over. I'm going to try to speed up. We got a few more minutes. In chapter 11, it's the final thing. It talks about, "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse," this is verse 1, "and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord." And it goes down and explains it even more. But I find that Isaiah is not just saying this one single prophecy that, oh, hey, there's going to be this child, he's going to be born, and he's just going to be a sign. But he seems to spend several chapters, obviously it wasn't chapters in that time, but he spends quite a while seemingly expanding upon this idea of Emmanuel, whose land it is, of a child to be born who is wonderful, mighty. The government will rest upon his shoulders, who will fill the throne of David for the rest of eternity. The stem of Jesse, who's the Spirit of the Lord rests upon him. And so when Matthew looks back and sees Jesus fulfilling this prophecy, I don't think that he's looking back and just randomly looking for passages that could maybe fit to Jesus. He's looking back and seeing Jesus reflect in these passages that maybe even the prophets themselves did not fully understand. He looked back and saw descriptions of the now living Jesus, the Savior of the world, the God incarnate. And so when I confront these critics, these Jewish or liberal Christians who argue that, oh, Isaiah 7:14, it's not about Jesus, it's just about a natural born child, I think they miss the larger context of Isaiah and his prophecies and what he's trying to accomplish in these pages. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to go ahead and close the video. It's a little bit longer. Thanks for sticking around if you're still here. And I pray that you get something from it, and I pray that you, if you did get something from it, that you'll like, subscribe to the page, share with friends. I'm really excited for the next year. I got a lot of big plans coming up. But till then, thank you for everything. Good night.